Greetings and welcome back to room 303 in our chats with Emily, as we are calling our readings through the poetry of Emily Dickinson. We are using the Johnson edition, and we turn now to poem 503, Better Than Music for I Who Heard It. Now, in another riddle poem, and again, we call these poems riddle poems because we're not exactly sure what Emily is referencing when she talks about the experience that she is speaking to here. We do know from a letter, 146, that Emily made the observation, and the scholar David Priest has pointed this out. In a letter of 1853, to her friend Emily Ford, Emily said of her friend's recent marriage, which she had attended, that the actual ceremony, quote, seemed to me translation, not any earthly thing, and if a little after you'd ridden on the wind, it would not have surprised me, end quote. Now, our assumptions are that you've been following our stuff at learnstrong.net, down that left-hand side, Chats with Emily, our playlist. I'm hoping that you worked through our set of introductory comments, as well as the preceding 502 poems, to be able to place this poem. Again, we said riddle poems. Emily, of course, loving her riddles, making observations. The riddle that we can guess, we speedily despise. She says in poem 1222, in a letter to Sue, letter 586, her pal, she said, in a life that stopped guessing, you and I should not feel at home. Emily is always about challenging us to be guessers of a kind. And so here we are now looking at the translinguistic nature of profound experiences. Well, why do we call it translinguistic? You can't always give it to words. However, it is clear that maybe Shelley's song, the famous song to the Skylark, is going to play here. You'll remember Shelley, we given full lectures at learnstrong.net. You remember Shelley said, better than all measures of delightful sound, better than all treasures that in books are found, thy skill to poet were, thou scorner of the ground, the songbird, right? Teach me half the gladness that thy brain must know, such harmonious madness from my lips would flow. The world should listen then as I am listening now. Translation is going to be the key word of this poem, and I think that to some regards, Emily is playing that game. Now, we also want to remember Emily's love, passion for music. Mozart, in all her poems, gets used one and only one time, and it's here. This is what she says about an experience that is mind-altering. Better than music, for I who heard it. I was used to the birds before. This was different. 'Twas translation of all tunes I knew and more. 'Twasn't contained like other stanza. No one could play it the second time, but the composer, perfect Mozart, perished with him that keyless run. So children told how brooks in Eden bubbled a better melody, quaintly infer Eve's great surrender, urging the feet that would not fly. Children matured, are wiser mostly. Eden, a legend dimly told. Eve and the anguish, grand damned story. But I was telling a tune. I heard. Not such a strain the church baptizes when the last saint goes up the aisles. Not such a stanza splits the silence when the redemption strikes her bells. Let me not spill its smallest cadence, humming for promise when alone, humming until my faint rehearsal drop into tune around the throne. Of course, the genius of throne and alone is quite remarkable. Now, let's talk through this poem. First of all, she begins by saying something is even better than music, again reminding us of Shelley's Skylark, better than all measures of delightful sound, he'll say in that poem. Notice the exclamation point, better than music. What is better than music? We don't know. But some experience. For I, who heard it, again, we don't know what, I was used to the birds before, again, of course, Skylark being maybe referenced here. This, what we don't know what this is, was different. 'Twas translation. The only use of this poem, of this word, ever in all her poetry is here. Although we did have translated faces, you'll remember, of poem 253. I do think this word translation is the key word. In other words, whatever experience it is that she's had, it somehow has translated her out of her normal experiences into this other experience that now she's going to try to describe. And this is pure Emily. She's going to try to describe things you can't describe, kind of like describing a sunset, for example, or music and the like. I was used to the birds before. This was different. 'Twas translation of all tunes I knew and more. Now, again, we keep quoting this line from 772, all is the price of all. She says, there isn't anything I would exchange, all the tunes in the world, for the experience I'm talking about. And then what do we want to say about this in the second stanza? This experience, 'twasn't contained. In other words, you can't summate the experience like other stanza, we might say experiences here. No one could play it, we'll go to children later with the word play, the second time. In other words, it's you can't repeat it in any way. But the composer, and again, are we talking about an individual? Perfect Mozart. Again, the only time that she'll ever reference the genius. You'll remember that Mozart himself once said, was purported to have said, the music is not in the notes, but in the space between the notes, the silence between the notes. Perish with him. In other words, this is something that's going to go away with whoever the him is. That keyless rhyme. Now, some have said that Emily is in fact speaking about the poetry that she's creating and the poetry that she's heard that she's most moved by. And then she goes to Milton, and she goes to Genesis 3, and of course to Paradise Lost. We've given full lectures at learnstrong.net. So, dash, children, dashed, told how brooks in Eden, and of course that's that famous 4 rivers that run out of Eden in Genesis 3, in Genesis 2 and 3, bubbled a better melody. You notice the repetition of the B sounds here. Quaintly infer Eve's great surrender, the eating of the forbidden fruit, urging the feet that would not fly. Miller, the scholar, has pointed out just in that one line, urging the feet dash that would not, that would dash, not dash, fly. Her use of the dash to emphasize, urging the feet that would not fly. And then she's back to children again. In other words, whatever this experience is she's describing is more remarkable than even Eve's eating of the forbidden fruit at the beginning of the biblical corpus. And of course, Milton's Paradise Lost, right? Children matured are wiser. And then she'll play games with the word mostly. Eden, a legend. Is she talking about a myth here with legend? Dimly told, Eve and the anguish. Now you'll remember anguish from 264. You'll recall when we did that poem, a weight with needles on the pounds to push and pierce besides, that if the flesh resist the heft, the puncture coolly tries, that not a pore be overlooked of all this compound frame as manifold for anguish, as species be for name. When we get to 1736, at the very end of our study together, she'll play the game this way. Proud of my broken heart, since thou didst break it. Proud of the pain I did not feel till thee. Proud of my night, since thou with moons dost slack it. Not to partake thy passion, my humility. Thou canst not boast like Jesus, drunken without companion was the strong cup of anguish brewed for the Nazarene. Thou canst not pierce tradition with the peerless puncture. See, I surpass thy crucifix to honor mine. She'll, of course, reference anguish in 32 of her poems. Here she says, the anguish, Grandam's story, only time Grandam gets used in all of her poetry. But I was telling a tune I heard. What's she saying? There are these stories, like the story of Genesis 3 and the fall of Eden, even though, as we point out in our lectures over Milton's Paradise Lost, that the word fall never actually gets used in the Genesis 3 story. Her point here is that this tune, this story, this experience exceeds anything that I learned in my religious experience. Not, notice here, repetition of not here 3 times. Not such a strain the church baptizes. Again, trans-religious, we might even say, when the last saint goes up the aisles. Not such a stanza. You're hearing all these S sounds? Not such a stanza splits the silence when the redemption strikes her bells. Let me not spill, as in, translate, maybe? Its smallest cadence back to the tune. Humming, and of course we know our love of hummingbirds. Humming for promise when alone. Humming until my faint rehearsal. You'll remember rehearsal from our study of 379, that Middle English notion of the hearse, that is to say, some kind of harrow which breaks up the ground, harrowing as in a bad experience, we might say, until my faint rehearsal, of course here tune and rehearsal makes sense, drop into tune around the throne of God. In other words, she's making the argument that the majestic angelic music around the throne of God is nothing like the experience musically that she got to enjoy. Well, what are we going to do with a poem like this at 2A? I think that she's making the argument that our most precious tunes are always translinguistic. You can't explain it with words. It's the experience alone. At 2B, obviously, the riddle of what experience, and I love all these S sounds. This is a fun poem to read out loud, and obviously our use of the dash we would want to put in our notes as well. At 3A, well, obviously we mentioned Shelley, Milton, and Paradise Lost as well. I think that stands behind much of this. Finally at 3B, and obviously the tunes of Mozart, no doubt. Finally at 3B, what do you think she is talking about? And what was a time when you had such an experience that was translinguistic, and yet you loved the tune no matter that? Thank you.